Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Letters from the Ancient World. In this episode, we'll be looking at the mysterious figure of Apollonius of Tyana, a holy man and miracle worker who flourished in the 1st century AD. Apollonius was a member of the Pythagorean movement, so a good place for us to start is to look at the Pythagorean movement and its origins. Who were these people, and what did they believe? Their founder, Pythagoras, is a very shadowy figure. He lived around 500 BC, before the golden age of Greek civilization, and before Rome was anything more than a town in central Italy. He probably grew up on the Greek island of Samos before moving to Croton in southern Italy. Southern Italy was studded with Greek colonies in this period. He and his followers may subsequently have been expelled from Croton to another southern Italian city, Metapontum. To the best of our knowledge, Pythagoras wrote nothing. Our knowledge of him begins with fragments of writings about him, which date from 150 years after his death. Most people remember Pythagoras today as the inventor of the famous theorem on triangles. The square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides. There is some evidence that Pythagoras may have been interested in numbers, but we can be fairly sure that he wasn't a mathematician in the modern sense. It only seems to have been after his death that a split developed among his followers between those with religious interests, the acousmatikoi, and those with scientific interests, the mathematikoi. The man himself was first and foremost a religious guru. More specifically, he belonged to the long line of religious teachers, like Buddha and St. Benedict, who have taught that asceticism is the path to the sacred. Pythagoras accordingly seems to have laid down a distinctive way of life for his followers, an ascetic lifestyle which included unusual dietary rules. He became famous in later times as a vegetarian, although our sources don't agree on whether he abstained from eating all meat or only some kinds. Pythagoras' main contribution to religious thought seems to have been the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. The Greeks in general weren't especially interested in life after death, but Pythagoras was an exception. He was credited with teaching the doctrine of reincarnation. This included the transmigration of souls between humans and other animals. Abstaining from eating animals makes some sense if you believe that human souls might end up in them. It might also make sense if you were trying, Buddhist style, to escape your cycle of incarnations by purifying yourself. The Pythagoreans were part of the radical fringe of ancient Greek religion. They come over as a kind of cross between monks and hippies. Other Greeks mocked them for their eccentric way of life. It didn't help that they seem to have had some involvement in politics. Their distinctive combination of esoteric teachings, fraternalism and political activity has been compared to modern Freemasonry. By about the 300s BC, the original Pythagorean movement seemed to be on the decline, but from around the 1st century BC, the movement underwent a renaissance. Pythagoras came to be seen as a kind of semi-divine figure, a master teacher who had given the other great Greek philosophers their ideas. Pythagoras and his legacy were reinvented as a kind of storehouse of wisdom on subjects ranging across metaphysics, magic, music, mathematics and morality. It was in this context that our friend Apollonius emerged. He came from Tyana in modern-day Turkey. He appears to have lived in the 1st century AD. He apparently wrote several treatises on philosophical and religious topics. The scraps of these that survive are recognisably the work of a Pythagorean philosopher. Apollonius advocated an ascetic, virtuous lifestyle, and he showed a particular disdain for worldly wealth. He seems to have acknowledged both the traditional gods of the Greek pantheon and a higher transcendent godhead. He also seems to have opposed traditional ritual practices. This surviving fragment from his works is particularly interesting. I believe that we would best show proper respect for God if to him we should sacrifice nothing at all, for he needs nothing even from beings who are greater than we are, nor is there any plant nor any animal to which there is not some defilement attached. But we should always ask for good things from the noblest of beings, by what is noblest in ourselves, which is the mind. This is intriguing stuff. It's a pity that more of Apollonius' works haven't survived. Our main source for Apollonius' life is a long biography written by one Philostratus, a Greek orator who had connections with the imperial family. It isn't quite clear where Philostratus got his information from. He refers to a number of sources, in particular an earlier biography of Apollonius by one Damis of Nineveh. But Damis' work has not survived, and we have no way of knowing how accurate it was. Some have suggested that Philostratus made it up. On the whole, the Apollonius who comes through to us from Philostratus' biography has the feel of a fictional character. Philostratus' work is essentially novelistic. It's written in a somewhat rhetorical style, and its atmosphere is curiously unreal. It's characterised by anecdotes and digressions, and it has the general air of a romance composed for entertainment, rather than a work of strong intellectual fibre. It's certainly not a philosophical treatise, although there are some references to Pythagorean concerns, such as reincarnation, vegetarianism and numbers. Philostratus doesn't attribute any very profound or detailed teachings to Apollonius. It's particularly interesting that the opinions expressed by the real Apollonius in the quotation that I referred to, opposing traditional sacrifices to the gods, find little or no place in Philostratus' work. The Apollonius of Philostratus' biography doesn't discourse on the ineffable Godhead and the uselessness of making sacrifices to it. He cheerfully dispenses advice on traditional cultic practices. Like Pythagoras himself, Apollonius is presented not only as a philosopher, but as a semi-legendary hero. He is exemplary in virtue and wisdom. He has supernatural gifts, including clairvoyance and healing powers. He is honoured even by the gods. He travels around the known world, Mesopotamia, Iran, India, Spain and Egypt, just as Pythagoras was said to have done. He converses with kings and emperors. Apollonius, the ascetic philosopher, was turned into a kind of demigod, just as Pythagoras had been. Apollonius ended up gaining a certain notoriety as a kind of pagan equivalent to Jesus Christ. Certain similarities between the two characters were noticed both by ancient pagans and by rationalists in the era of the Enlightenment, like Voltaire, Charles Blount and Lord Herbert. For their part, Christian writers were divided about Apollonius. Some accepted and admired him, like Eusebius and Sidonius Apollinaris. Others, like Tommaso Malvenda, thought that he was inspired by Satan. There is little to be gained from pursuing this tired old quarrel. Apollonius and Jesus were both revered as holy men with supernatural powers, just like numerous other figures in history. But it's much better to study each of them in his own context than it is to pit them against each other in a game of religious polemic. Jesus of Nazareth is best viewed in a first-century Jewish context, and Apollonius, likewise, is more interesting in his own right than as a tool for undermining his more famous counterpart.